Hello, everyone. My name is David Simmons Wood. I'm the programs director for Early Music America. I wanted to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon with Dr. Paula Maust, expanding the Western classical canon. We're very happy that those of you who could join us here live on Zoom right now could be here. And if you're watching this in our archive in the future, we thank you for stopping by and visiting. We're going to go ahead and get started right away and not wait for anyone else for the sake of time. The presentation today will be about 45 minutes long, and then following that, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes worth of questions. Please feel free to put questions into the chat at any time, and we're going to keep track of those. So if you think of something you have a question for, you don't want to just keep it in your brain until the end, please put it in the chat and we'll be monitoring that and keeping track of those, and then going to those questions and addressing any and as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. So our speaker today, as I said, is Dr. Paula Maust, who is an assistant professor of theory at the Peabody Institute at Johns Hopkins University, has also taught at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Paula's work also includes printed materials, and she's a harpsichordist and a co-director of Burning River Baroque and Musica Spira. And we're very happy that Paula is here to talk to us today about her work and research that revolves around a website that's a wonderful resource called Expanding the Music Theory Canon. And you can find that by Googling for it, and we'll put it in the chat here in a minute so that you all can use that resource, and as that's referenced throughout. And this is looking at creating or expanding the early music theory canon is an open source collection of music theory examples by women and composers of color. And without any more from me, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paula, who is going to be presenting this afternoon. Paula, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. It's great to see so many familiar faces and also to see some new people. I'm really excited to talk to you today about some of the work that I have been doing in my research for the past several years. When I started teaching collegiate Western classical music theory and history 5 years ago, I was honestly shocked by the complete lack of musical examples by women and composers of color that I found in the mainstream textbooks. I had naively assumed that educational resources would be much more inclusive than they were when I was an undergraduate student in the early 2000s. After all, I was heartened to look out at my classrooms and see what appeared to be a beautifully diverse and changing face of classical music. But academia had failed to make the foundational resources used to teach young professional classical musicians inclusive of diverse perspectives. To counter this lack of representation, I immediately began collecting more inclusive examples to use in my classes. Then last year, in the midst of the angst of the pandemic, in the middle of an entire year of canceled concerts and the desperate cries throughout the US for racial equity and justice, I felt that I needed to do something, anything constructive to counter the devastation that I saw all around me. And so I decided to create something in the one area I felt like I had the capacity to bring about meaningful change. I meticulously perused several thousand pages of musical scores, and then I took it and put it together and designed Expanding the Music Theory Canon as an anthology supplement for the undergraduate music theory sequence. When I released the website as an open source platform in late January of this year, I honestly had no idea what the response might be. Perhaps it would be ignored, or perhaps I would receive vitriolic emails from the angry white male music theorists who've egregiously threatened other scholars who've recently spoken out about racism in the field. To my pleasant surprise, the website went viral immediately, quickly reaching 10,000 users in 54 countries. Within a month, I had a book contract offered to me from SUNY Press based on the site, and I've since spoken about this topic to numerous universities across the country. This gives me great hope and seems to indicate that many musicians are indeed ready for significant change. And so today it is my pleasure to talk with you about the historical trajectory of canonization in Western classical music and the ways I think we can all begin to shift the narrative to be more inclusive in our own teaching and concert programming. Several months ago, a colleague of mine became entangled in a YouTube comment debate on a live stream of Martin Roscoe's performance of piano music by Franz Schubert. My colleague is familiar with Roscoe's recording of music by Amy Beach and Rebecca Clark, and he commented that he was disappointed that the program was not more inclusive of diverse composers. Within minutes, a viewer wrote, "We must assume you are joking about the program." After commenting that and assuring the commenter that he was not joking, my colleague received the following reply. "The music of Schubert has stood the test of time. The color of his skin and his sex or gender have nothing to do with the quality of the music. There may indeed be better music by Schubert, but even his less good material is worth repeated hearing. I have my doubts that the works of Ms. Beach and Ms. Clark will be quite so successful, but neither you nor I will be here in 200 years to find out." As you might imagine, the conversation spiraled downward from there. But this argument that works by canonical Western classical composers like Beethoven, Schubert, Mozart, Haydn, and Bach have stood the test of time is all too familiar and begs the very important question of what structural systems enabled masterpieces by great white male composers to stand the test of time. Furthermore, is this canonical music really inherently better than all other pieces? And who exactly is the arbiter of what is and isn't great enough to be passed on to subsequent generations? In the introduction to her new book, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, Ijeoma Oluwa asserts that we should not be surprised by issues like police brutality, the gender wage gap, and countless other contemporary injustices because our social systems are, quote, working according to design. Systemic inequities are perpetuated and complacently accepted by society at large because they were designed to prop up white male mediocrity as the dominant narrative. And, quote, everything in our society is centered around preserving white male power, regardless of white male skill or talent. Before anyone logs off in anticipation of my next sentence being that I think that Bach and Palestrina were mediocre composers, rest assured that is absolutely not my purpose today. There is, in my opinion, no doubt that Beethoven, Handel, Bach, and their canonical colleagues were brilliant composers. But this handful of white men who have been glorified to an almost godlike place of prominence constitute only a small portion of the story of Western classical music's development. Those of us who perform early music are perhaps already quite aware of this, as the very music we specialize in is often relegated to the fringes of classical music culture. However, the contributions of numerous women and people of color from every century since antiquity have been erased from our retelling of music history. As I mentioned, this omission is particularly glaring in the mainstream pedagogical materials used to teach Western classical theory and history at the collegiate level. These texts evolved in cultural systems steeped in racism and sexism, and rather than being rewritten, the books have merely been continuously revised. Accordingly, then, they continue to function as designed, perpetuating a lack of representation. For example, the 7 most used music theory textbooks in the US contain 2,930 musical examples, of which just 2.15% are by women and 1.67% are by people of color. Less than 1% of the examples in these books are by women of color. Although music history textbooks have slightly better representation, clear preference is still bestowed on those composers deemed great men. Whole chapters are devoted to Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, and Haydn, while Francesca Caccini gets a cursory mention as her father's daughter, who, by the way, also happened to be the first known woman in Western Europe to compose a fully staged musical dramatic work in the 17th century. How is it possible then that after 30 years of feminist musicology and the more recent incorporation of critical race theory into academic music studies, that we still have this extraordinary racial and gender representational gap in our pedagogical materials? Why does our field continue to perpetuate racist tropes about exoticism when referring to any composer who was not white? And why is every woman lucky enough to be included always an important man's wife, lover, daughter, sister, or student? And most importantly, what can we do to change the narrative for the next generation? My work on expanding the music theory canon has focused primarily on demonstrating the wealth of common practice era music composed by women and people of color active between 1600 and 1900. As such, my presentation today addresses canonicity and concert programming during that time. I first discuss the historical origins of musical canons and then look at how racism, classism, and sexism are perpetuated today. Along the way, I will introduce you to the music of 3 composers featured on my website and share results of a recent study I conducted on racial and gender representation in Western classical music instruction. As I will demonstrate, the historical narrative of Western classical music arose as part of social systems that privileged the experiences and accomplishments of white men. And it is time for us to rewrite those accounts to more accurately reflect the diverse array of voices that contributed to classical music's development. Classical music in much of the 20th and 21st centuries has been dominated by a small group of canonical composers. Bachtrack.com, the largest online listing for classical music performances, reported that 13% of the 20,535 classical concerts they listed in 2019 featured a work by Beethoven. And not surprisingly, their list of the top 10 composers performed that year closely aligns with the demographics of composers whose work is most densely represented in US music theory textbooks. These statistics perhaps give the illusion that the Western classical canon is an immutable entity birthed in the 19th century and permanently shackled to our musical heritage. But a deeper look into historical trends reveals that the canon fluctuated significantly at different times and places. Indeed, it was not until close to the turn of the 20th century that the composers and musical works in our contemporarily accepted canon were cemented into their current place of prominence. Prior to the 18th century, it was rare for music to be performed more than a decade after a composer's death. Patrons employed composers to continue creating new pieces rather than reusing historic works. Older music, particularly polyphonic works by Josquin, Palestrina, and Frescobaldi, formed a body of scholarly music used as teaching models for later 17th century composers. But these so-called old-fashioned pieces were rarely performed in the late 17th century. The initial impetus to revive and perform ancient music arose in England in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Disgusted with the corrupt theater music and frivolous sacred music of the time, Arthur Bedford published his polemical The Great Abuse of Music in 1711. Bedford first looked to the distant past of musical practices of the ancient Greeks, Jews, and Romans to praise their taste for music that was pure, before unleashing his vengeance on the musical practices of his time. He wrote, quote, "I am sorry to see a liberal art thus prostituted, and the muses who were once sober, chaste, and pious, to be now turned bawds, procurers, and promoters of all uncleanness and debauchery." Bedford suggested that returning to the older sacred works of William Byrd would solve the country's musical problems because, quote, "there are patterns enough composed by the best masters as fine as the other." There was an increasingly prevalent belief throughout the century that looking to great music of the past was an important way to speak out against the commercialization of the music industry and to return to a romanticized ideal of older, better, and less corrupt times in England. To that end, institutions including the Academy of Ancient Music and the Concerts of Ancient Music were established in 1731 and 1776, respectively. This notion that a reverence for music of the past could purify the arts and culture industry continued into the 19th century and spread to other regions of Western Europe. In Germany, for example, Schumann wrote pithy quips about those he accused of writing music for profit rather than purely for artistry. And he asserted that the then old quartets of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven had, quote, indestructible vitality. It was not just moral concerns or austere desires that led to the development of a musical canon of historical works. John Locke's empirical principles tremendously influenced thinking about music, which shifted from metaphysical and scientific speculation to empirical and analytical discourses. The disciplines of music history and criticism developed alongside the classical music canon, with monumental historical chronologies by authors such as Charles Burney and periodicals such as the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. As musicologist William Weber notes, quote, if repertory constitutes the framework of canon, the critical discourse empowers it, endowing old works with authority over musical composition and taste. 19th century Western Europeans also often fixated on the figure of the male hero, which was immortalized in Thomas Carlyle's 1840 great man theory. Carlyle wrote, quote, all things that we see standing accomplished in the world are properly the outer material result, the practical realization and embodiment of thoughts that dwelt in the great men sent into the world. Musical connoisseurs like E.T.A. Hoffmann and Franz Brendel wrote extensively about music to educate a broad public readership about the great musical men of the past and their compositions. Knowledge of Western classical music was no longer reserved for elite patrons, educated aristocrats, and professional musicians. In fact, it became a core component of public education. That education, however, was fully immersed in a limited set of works by white men that were deemed worthy of canonization by other like-minded white men. This obsession with works by so-called great men also coincided with substantial changes in concert programming. An incredibly clear example can be seen at the Leipzig Gewandhaus, where in the late 18th century, just 11% of works performed were by dead composers. By 1911, however, 81% were by dead canonic composers. In the 200 years between Bedford's call for a return to older values and the 1911 concert season, programming had completely shifted from featuring almost exclusively new music to almost exclusively old music. Furthermore, the voices of women and people of color were absent from the narrative entirely, despite the fact that they were actively contributing to musical culture during this time. Marcia Citron's 1993 Gender and the Musical Canon was the first scholarly monograph dedicated to evaluating the social and professional reasons women were excluded from canonical status. She discusses how historical women were encouraged to interpret rather than to create music, and that working as a professional musician often did not align with societal expectations for women with families. Citron also suggests that women compose pieces in genres considered to be less serious, and that there were fewer opportunities for women to have their music performed by prominent professional ensembles. These observations are certainly apt descriptors of the brutal realities women faced throughout the common practice era and well into the 20th century. But I want to suggest that another critical component that contributed to the exclusion of works by women has to do with the ways male authors described female musicians. Many early modern primary sources about professional women musicians in Western Europe fixate on the women's appearances and sexual relationships through the eyes of male spectators. For example, Horace Walpole expressed disgust that the operatic superstar Francesca Cuzzoni was short and squat and had a doughy cross face. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was devastated that the women singing and playing exquisite music behind the screens of the Venetian Ospedale Grandi were scarcely without some striking physical defect. Charles Burney, on the other hand, praised English opera singer Anastasia Robinson's pleasing, modest countenance with large blue eyes, and Restoration singer-actress Anne Bracegirdle's purported virginity rendered her the darling of the theater. Often, more attention was given to extra musical affairs surrounding women musicians than to their actual musical achievements. This way of writing about women continued through the 19th century, with musical women being placed in relational deference to powerful men, and male authors glorifying appropriately feminine behaviors and vilifying or ignoring that which was too far out of bounds. It should not be surprising then that nearly all of the pre-20th century musical examples by women in music theory textbooks are by Clara Schumann and Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, making their music the most canonical works by women composers from the common practice era. In addition to being lucky enough to be enmeshed in the musical circles of important men, both women appropriately performed their expected female roles. Clara expertly played the part of the dutiful wife to Robert, often championing his works at the expense of her own creative output. Likewise, Fanny's deference to familial expectations to curb her musical career while her brother Felix was exalted earned her a spot in history and theory books as well. Subconscious social and behavioral expectations for composers of color during the common practice period are perhaps even more explicit. In his 1735 Systema Naturae, Carl Linnaeus codified the concept of race by dividing humans into the categories of whitish Europeans, reddish American Indians, tawny Asians, and blackish Africans. His Eurocentric doctrine further asserted that Europeans were, quote, acute, inventive, governed by laws. Africans, he said, on the other hand, were crafty, indolent, negligent, and governed by caprice. This devastating perspective was used repeatedly as a justification for the horrors of enslavement, and it also points to some of the reason that music by composers like Ignatius Sancho may not have made it into the canon. It seems quite likely that the falsely assumed attitude that his race predisposed him to engage in crafty, indolent, and negligent behaviors contributed to the exclusion of his musical works and biography from our historical narratives. After all, could this inherently ugly behavior of a blackish African be perceived as beautiful by the whitish Europeans whose voices dominated the formation of the canon? To be sure, the cultural construction of beauty in a particular time and place always dictated the parameters of what became part of the canon. And when our Western classical canon emerged, it was the creative output of white men that was socially and culturally deemed most beautiful and worthy of being passed on to future generations. The templates for many of our contemporary reference materials arose from these systemically racist and sexist structures. For example, the first edition of a Dictionary of Music and Musicians, edited by George Grove, was published in London in 1879. It now resides electronically in the Oxford Music Online platform and is regularly revised. Unfortunately, the biographical writing about historical women composers in Grove is often quite poor. There are, of course, some excellent articles written more recently by feminist musicologists, but for the most part, little has changed about biographical writing in the past 140 years when women are being discussed. Most articles about women composers focus more on their appearances and sexual relationships than on their musical accomplishments. As an example, today, let's compare the 1879 Grove biography of Isabella Colburn with the current one on Oxford Music Online. Here is the article about Colburn from 1879. As you can see, it starts with identifying her father and his occupation to establish her credibility. Then her teachers are listed, followed by her singing accomplishments and a review of her performance. Her sexual influence with Barbaja is mentioned, as is her reception with the King of Naples, again positioning her next to influential men. She's married to Rossini, travels with him, sings his music, does not perform well in London, and retires. The last sentence is the only reference in the entire article to her compositions. She was herself a composer and has left a few collections of songs. The current Colburn bio on Oxford Music Online bears striking resemblance to the 1879 bio. Colburn is again identified in relation to her teachers and discussed as a singer. We learn a bit more about her individual roles and how her vocal prowess influenced Rossini. Her failure on the London stage is recounted, as is her separation from Rossini. Again, the only word about her compositions is in the very last sentence. She composed 4 volumes of songs. In 140 years of revised editions of this text, was no one's curiosity piqued enough to dig up the manuscripts for these songs, which are extant, by the way, there are several of them on the website, and write another paragraph about them? Moreover, why is this article still primarily focused on the important men in Colburn's life rather than on her own significant work? After all, one could argue that Rossini would not have become immortalized in the operatic canon without Colburn's successful performances of his music. To be sure, for Colburn to even have an individual article separate from Rossini's in the 1879 edition of Grove was quite significant and demonstrates how her career as an opera singer was deemed to be important in the late 19th century. Francesca Caccini, for example, has 1 sentence at the end of her father's 1879 biographical entry. Caccini's daughter, Francesca, was celebrated both as a singer and composer. Likewise, Louise Farranc's biography is listed as part of her husband's entry, and Clara Schumann's multi-page entry contains just a few brief sentences about her compositions, discussing very little about the music that she wrote. I surmise that a large part of the problem with the way women continue to be biographically described is because resources like Grove are simply revising existing texts originally written in the 19th century, rather than rewriting them to be reflective of more inclusive and representational contemporary values. Isabella Colburn's current article is heavily based on a template from 1879, even though our understanding of women's worth and value as professional musicians has shifted monumentally in the past 140 years. However, at least women were included in the 1879 edition of Grove. Joseph Bellone, for example, was highly revered in his day as a prolific composer and virtuoso performer. He's referenced multiple times as the notorious Chevalier de Saint-Georges in other people's 1879 Grove articles, but he does not get his own entry, and his music is never discussed. Perhaps it was because he was French, and the formation of the Western canon was driven by German music critics who favored German composers. But it is also plausible that he was not viewed as a worthy creator because he was Black, as many other French composers were very much included in the 1879 edition of Grove. The 19th century gatekeepers who ultimately wrote Bellone and other composers of color out of Western classical music history may or may not have done so out of deliberate racial discrimination, and we will never completely know, of course, what their motivations were. But by omitting women and people of color, they established the racist and sexist trope that classical music worthy of canonical status was exclusively written by so-called great white men. The process of repeatedly revising the same template of a flawed historical narrative across many decades is also present in music history textbooks, thereby perpetuating false information to subsequent generations of professional musicians. For example, the first edition of Donald J. Grout's A History of Western Music, which all of us have probably read multiple times, was published in 1960. At the time, it was a monumental achievement and a much needed resource. Now in its 10th edition, the original template of the book remains intact and it continues to be used regularly. This is the sum total of racial and gender diversity found in the 818 pages of the 1960 edition of Grout. As you can see, The 2019 10th edition is certainly markedly better in this regard, but the text remains problematic. Musicians active before 1900 are in red. Only 41 of the 161 women and people of color in the 10th edition of this textbook are from the lengthy period of time from antiquity all the way to 1900, while 120 were active in the 20th and 21st centuries. Of course, I'm quite pleased to see diverse coverage of the 20th and 21st century musicians, but the underlying narrative of this book remains that very few women and composers of color were writing meaningful classical music before the 20th century, which is simply not true. Moreover, nearly all the Black composers featured in A History of Western Music wrote jazz, rock, ragtime, R&B, pop music, and other folk styles, thereby perpetuating the racist stereotype that Black musicians were only successful in their own genres and did not historically contribute to Western classical music. This is also false and demonstrates that merely revising an old text is an insufficient means of truly rewriting the historical narrative of women and composers of color. I've mentioned repeatedly today that there were lots and lots of women and people of color actively writing music during the Common Practice era, and I would be remiss if I did not share a little tiny portion of that with you today. The 50+ composers featured on Expanding the Music Theory Canon are just a minute portion of the women and people of color who were writing Western classical music from about 1600 to 1900. In fact, this year I'm working on a substantial expansion of the site to include music by at least 50 additional composers, many of whom have scores that only exist in archival collections that I'm in the process of acquiring from places like Cuba. So stay tuned for that. I'm very excited for when they're going to arrive. But for today, let's look at the music and careers of the three composers that you see on the screen. Sophia Dušek was an English singer, a harpist, and composer who made her debut at the Solomon Concerts in 1791 under the direction of Haydn. She premiered Haydn's The Storm and was a soloist in the London premiere of Mozart's Requiem. She moved to Paddington in 1812 and founded a music school and published extensively. Her compositional output is primarily for harp and consists of sonatas and 6 books of themes and variations. She also wrote 3 sonatas for keyboard and violin, a piano sonata, and a sonata for keyboard, violin, and German flute. This is an excerpt of Ye Banks and Braes, and this is a piece that I use often when I'm teaching periods in Theory 2. Francis or Frank Johnson was a Black American violinist, Kent bugle player, bandmaster, and composer. He was the first Black American to publish sheet music and to take a band to Europe on tour. His successful career resulted in other Black American composers finding music publishers. As the band leader of the Philadelphia State Fencibles, he performed at prestigious events throughout the 1820s, including the annual birthday celebrations of George Washington and the reception of the Haitian leader Jean-Pierre Boyer in 1825. While on tour in London and Paris, he played for Queen Victoria, who awarded him a silver bugle. He published more than 200 pieces. This is an excerpt of one of his cantillions, which I use to teach 5/6 chords. José Mauricio Núñez Garcia was widely regarded as the most important Brazilian composer during his lifetime, and he was appointed the Mestre de Capella of the Rio de Janeiro Cathedral in 1798. For 28 years, Garcia taught free music courses to the public. By 1808, he had composed several graduals, hymns, antiphons, and masses, and his work caught the attention of the Portuguese prince. This led to Garcia's next appointment as Mestre de Capella of the Royal Chapel and an increase in his compositional output. He wrote more than 237 works and was famous for his keyboard improvisations. This is an excerpt of his Liber a Me that I used to teach augmented sixth chords. In March, I conducted a study in which I asked participants to share their experiences with racial and gender representation in Western classical music instruction. My questions were intended to suss out the attitudes that implicitly or explicitly justified the omission of women and people of color. A full report of that study can be read in the most recent volume of the Journal of the International Alliance for Women in Music, but I will share some of the results with you today. Here are the demographics of the respondents to the survey. Educational theorists and practitioners have repeatedly demonstrated that greater representation of groups of people and points of view in textbooks tremendously influence students' perspectives of themselves and the world. Those who defend the stagnancy in music pedagogical resources often argue that the musical examples we currently use have worked well for decades, thereby rendering change unnecessary. This is very true in music theory, where most of the examples used in contemporary texts date back to Walter Piston's 1941 Harmony book. Here are some responses participants gave when asked about the significance of their first experience studying a classical work by a woman. Quote, "I remember thinking, why is she the first I have learned about? It made me feel included in a world of old dead men." Likewise, these are a selection of responses provided when asked the same question about their first experience with a piece of classical music by a composer of color. Quote, "It was a new experience. I remember being excited that people of color had compositions, that I could share these with my students. It was a very significant experience because as an African-American child, I was always questioning whether playing classical music was something I should be doing." Negative stereotypes about women and composers of color from those in positions of authority in the classroom are also still prevalent. Here are some recollections from survey respondents about how musical women were portrayed in their classes and lessons. Most of these responses came from participants under the age of 35. Music history courses, when female musicians were mentioned, which was extremely rare, would always focus on their gender, far more than anything else about them. I don't recall actually hearing any examples of their music in classes, looking at any of their scores, or completing any assignments at all involving their actual music. No theory class I've taken has ever mentioned a female composer, and I've taken many, many theory classes. It was repeatedly implied that women weren't writing historically, and even if they were, it wasn't important enough to stay in the canon. I also remember being told that women were not capable of writing major works. As a composer myself, this affected my concept of my own skill for years. Likewise, here is a selection of responses about biases respondents encountered about composers of color. We had a mini unit on Joseph Boulogne, except I don't think we used his actual name a single time. We were told to refer to him as Black Mozart. A young conductor of a small regional orchestra suggested in a fundraising meeting in 2020 that there were no racial minority composers to program. Students of color at my high school were pushed into jazz, gospel, and contemporary music much harder than white students, and they were actively discouraged from pursuing careers in classical music. Perhaps we might envision ourselves as too progressive or too unbiased to perpetuate these attitudes, but it can be all too easy for the narratives surrounding women and people of color to remain steeped in stories of oppression and heroic overcoming by a few outliers. I am not suggesting that we ever diminish the atrocities of enslavement and the racist, classist, ableist, and sexist suppression that surely stifled an unfathomable amount of creative output. To be sure, every woman and person of color who composed during the common practice era was breaking boundaries and pushing against systemic barriers, and probably also got really lucky. And those structural inequities must be acknowledged and called out. But it must be done in a way that does not silence the voices of the myriad of historical women and people of color who created Western classical music. After all, if the dominant narrative is that women and people of color had limited access to educational resources and little influence for publishing, their work can more easily continue to be dismissed as unworthy of serious study. Moreover, focus on narratives of oppression have led many to complacently assume that women and people of color were simply not composing any music, which couldn't be further from the truth. In our important work of highlighting the ways in which the white male patriarchy worked according to its design, it is crucial that we retell our historical narratives in ways that take the power out of the hands of the oppressors. We cannot achieve this by tokenizing a handful of women and or people of color as rare anomalous heroes and declaring our diversity initiative to be successfully completed. So what can we do? How do we move beyond the argument of a narrow canon of works that have stood the test of time to create meaningful change in our educational and performance endeavors? I certainly do not claim to have all of the answers or solutions to our problems, of course, and I think it will take a massive creative intellectual effort to move our field forward on a path toward greater inclusivity. But there are ways we can all make improvements now, starting with the music we use to teach our students. Musicians tend to perform music they were made familiar with as students, as indicated in the Bach track statistics, where the most common classical composers performed in 2019 align with the composers represented most densely in music theory texts. To be sure, the music of these composers is, as I said, worth serious study, but do we really need 95 examples by Bach and 94 examples by Mozart in one textbook that only has 465 total musical examples? What if perhaps we were to reduce the number of examples for each of those composers to a very respectable 20 examples for each one? In Aldwell-Schachter textbook, for example, that would collectively free up 149 examples for works by non-canonical composers, thereby exposing students to a much wider array of musical voices. In the first edition of A History of Western Music, Grout indicated that his musical examples were selected from works available in score anthologies in 1960. The tremendous amount of scholarship produced in the past 60 years has unveiled thousands of works by women and people of color, and many of the manuscripts are public domain and on IMSLP. So the arguments that the music does not exist or is inaccessible are simply no longer valid. We need to normalize studying and playing works by women and people of color, and not just in 2021 when it's the cool, socially conscious thing to do, but we need to do this consistently moving forward. Our students are the next generation of professional musicians, and it is up to us to instill values of inclusivity in them. We must also change the way we describe composers from underrepresented groups. Right now, when women and people of color are largely absent in our narratives, it is imperative that we continue to label them as such, to raise awareness about their presence in a world that has been previously dominated by white men. Ultimately, however, a woman or person of color who writes music is simply a composer. And as we create a more inclusive narrative, they should be referred to as such. Additionally, the obstacles that composers overcame should never overshadow their own professional accomplishments. We must acknowledge that Francis Johnson experienced horrific acts of racially motivated violence, but it is equally important to study the ways he used his influential career to pave the way for many other Black American composers to publish their own music. We should also stop positioning women and people of color in relational deference to powerful white men around them. For example, rather than starting Francesca Caccini's biography with Francesca Caccini was the daughter of the famed Giulio Caccini, it could say Francesca Caccini was the highest paid musician at the Medici court during her lifetime and the first known woman to compose a staged musical dramatic work. After establishing her credibility based on her own tremendous merits, then we can discuss her musical family and early training. This repositioning automatically sets the reader up to respect Francesca on her own terms, rather than propping her up as worthy of study merely because her father happened to write a very influential book. Change is often fraught with tension and resistance, but it seems that the US is more poised for significant social reform to address structural inequities than it has been for quite some time. In the midst of this momentum, I believe we all have the capacity to create meaningful change in the narrative surrounding common practice era women and people of color. Our students, our audiences, and future generations of musicians will all benefit from the important work that we do as musicians to expand the canon. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing your questions in the chat.
Thank you, Paula. And yes, any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat and we'll take them as we can. And if they seem to sort of go together, we can pull them together, but we're happy to answer your questions that way. In the meantime, you mentioned that you have a slate of composers that you're anxiously awaiting. Are there any sneak previews or anything that you would like to give us while we're here?
Yes, absolutely. I have been working really hard on hopefully getting some scores from a Cuban, an Afro-Cuban woman named Catalina Baroa, who was active in the late 19th century and early 20th century as a composer. She was an organist, she was a music director at a cathedral, she wrote masses and organ concertos. So that's the one I'm most excited about getting. I'm also been working with some people in some archives in Boston to potentially locate some opera scores by Louisa Melvin de los Mars, who was a Black woman living in Boston in the 1880s, who had 5 operettas that she wrote, premiered. The scores are thought to be lost, but we're working on digging through some of her papers to see if there's any indication that they might exist somewhere in a descendant's basement or something. And then I have a whole list of other people. I'm just in the process now of getting up works by Teresa Serena, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Chiquinha Gonzaga, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. So lots and lots of exciting stuff is coming. You can sign up on the homepage of the website if you would like to get updates whenever things are being added, so that you can see those things coming to you as well. But I have a gigantic list. And excellent student intern, I think, is here today, who is doing engraving for me for all of those examples. So coming soon. I'll be working on it all fall.
Wonderful, and we'll be sure to share through all of EMA's platforms when those updates happen as well. So we do have a few questions coming in, and of course lots of thank yous in the chat. But a couple I think we can combine here is have you reached out to, in this case they said the Grove editors, or even the Norton, the Western music. Have you reached out to any of those, or any sort of thoughts about the process of how to make changes there going forward?
I have not yet reached out to them. I have been thinking about it because so many of the articles need to be updated. A lot of them, the last update was 2001, which was of course now 20 years ago. It doesn't seem like it, but it really has been 20 years since a lot of those articles have been updated. But no, I have not. I have been thinking about, though, what could be done, because I think there's a lot of room for improvement. That's, I think for most of us, the first place that we send a student to go looking for a reference resource about a composer. And so, yeah, I have not been in touch with them, but that is on my list of things to think about, what the best way to do that might be. in terms of getting the Grove articles to be updated and to be better, especially the ones about women and the ones that seem to really be sort of still entrenched in like the 1879 format.
And with the caveat that the website is focusing on Western classical music, we did have a question about the role of non-classical music forms such as tango in the curriculum and as a potential way of expanding. So thoughts on that?
I think that would be fantastic. I mean, I have been saying to a lot of, especially music theorists and people working on theory curricula that, what I did was sort of like the first step towards creating more inclusive curriculum, but that, ultimately, I think when we're teaching people music theory, that we need to be moving beyond just the Western classical tradition. But because everyone is still teaching the Western classical tradition, the first thing we can do is to at least include more women and composers of color in that. But that when we, get to a point where we're ready to completely, I think, rip things apart and start over, which I think a lot of places are doing, right? Starting to rethink. I know Peabody is starting to really rethink our theory curriculum. I know Oberlin has just redone theirs, that then we do need to bring in other classical traditions, right? Tango and, classical musics from all parts of the world in some way. Of course, there's only 6 semesters, so there's also the question of what goes away. So there's a lot of thinking that has to be done, but I think we do need to be really thinking much more broadly about what we're teaching students inside of the conservatory curriculum.
Let's see. Are there resources you recommend for performers interested in programming a more diverse selection of work?
Yes. I think one of the best resources for women, finding women composers of music in your time period that you can then start to kind of cross-reference to is, I will put it in the chat, but it's Ladonna, and it's called The Big List. And Ladonna, The Big List is a list of a really, it's not exhaustive, but it's a very comprehensive list of many, many women composers, starting with Cassia, actually going all the way back to antiquity and moving up into more contemporary times. So that's a place to start to look for women composers. And then you can start to kind of narrow that down to see, of course, what instrument they happen to write for, if it matches up with what you're trying to program for ensembles. There's also the Composer Diversity Database. Are these all going? These are not going into the general chat. I'm sorry, everyone. So Ladonna, sorry to whoever I just personally messaged those things, The Big List and the Composer Diversity Database. So those are 2 places that I would suggest starting if you're wanting to do more inclusive concert programming. I also, on my website, set up I set up a composer page where you can go and click and see. It's, of course, a small subset of composers, but that's also another way that you can start to search for women and people of color who are writing music.
And I'm going to put in the chat here on the EMA website, we also have a link clearinghouse that we just call Resources for Diversity Early Music Repertoire, which focuses more particularly on that. But some of those that you've already put in are also linked there. Here's one. What would you tell anyone who brought up the outdated argument that compositions by women or people of color haven't been as good as those by the big stars of the canon?
Yeah. So I think what I usually say is, of course, what is good, right? That's a very subjective question as to what is good or what is great music. And that can be different in any context, in any time, to any different people. So that's the first thing that I would kind of pose as a question back to someone who would say that to me. And then I would also want to talk about, situations in which compositions by women or people of color arose that were just different situations. There's a lot of art songs which are sort of just sometimes relegated to not being very good music anyway. We talk a lot about, works by lots of composers, and sometimes even canonical composers, the art songs kind of get pushed to the side as less serious music than their symphonies or than their, major chamber work. So I think that there's a lot of prejudice about genres of music that people composed in as well. And women tended to compose by circumstance, often, not always, of course, in genres that were sort of considered to be less serious in general, that canonical composers also wrote in. So I think that there's also that sort of stereotype that comes in just based on genre as well. But I think the biggest thing to pose back would be who can really decide what is good, and what is good to me might be very different than what is good to you, and that society sort of, right, our underlying cultural framework determines what we sort of culturally accept as good, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it was.
There was a question, or a question about your familiarity with the Dictionary of Women Composers from 1995, and what your thoughts are about that.
Knowing Dictionary of Women Composers. I have looked at that. I haven't looked at it very recently though, but I have looked at it, and I can't remember enough to give you like my really solid opinion on it. I'm familiar with it. I've seen it in the library and perused it, but I have not looked at it very recently. So sorry, Joy, that I can't give you a more clear answer of that.
And we have just some comments in general here about just some other resources that are available. So those of you who are joining us live here can see some of these that have been published, just other examples of there. For questions. Thoughts about how to dovetail or merge existing fields. This is a little bit outside of what we're talking about, but merging the fields of ethnomusicology and classical music, I would say, traditional, what we consider musicology and ethnomusicology. So any thoughts on that, even though it's a little outside of the scope here?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we go, I think in 20 years from now, perhaps we won't be asking this question, because it will all be called musicology, of studying music in some kind of way. I think that we're moving towards kind of merging those two fields and identities. And I think it's really, to me, I think that that's a really important thing to do. And I say that as someone who I can't remember how many years I was a student, but a lot of them, because I did a bachelor's degree, 2 master's degrees, and a doctorate. So I was in school a long time, and I never had a world music class that was part of any curriculum that I was in. And I think that was a great disservice to me and all of my colleagues as students of Western classical music. And so I think that, as our world and society becomes more globalized, that the discipline of musicology needs to also become more globalized, and to incorporate and recognize musics from all different cultures. I think the more that we know, the better that we are as humans.
Other questions? We have just a minute or so for maybe one other question, if there are any. Just a reminder, we'll be archiving this talk from today on our YouTube channel, Early Music America's YouTube channel. We'll also have it on our page of video resources at earlymusicamerica.org. And we will have links to this on the diversity in early music, or resources in diversity for early music, I think so we call it, resources for diversity in early music repertoire page, so that you can always find Expanding Music Theory Canon website and any updates there. Here's one last question here. What's a recent composer discovery that you got really excited about?
I think the one I have been most excited about is, even though I haven't seen her music yet, so maybe I'll be less excited if I get to see it, is Catalina Berroa, this Afro-Cuban woman who was the music director at the cathedral in Trinidad, Cuba, and who wrote a lot of masses and choral works and organ music. I've been really just super excited to try to get my hands on some of those scores because her life sounds really fascinating. I think, I'm an organist as well, and there isn't tons of pre-20th century organ music by women. And so I'm really excited. Any colonial or early American discoveries? I've really been interested in getting to know the works of Francis Johnson. He's not colonial, he's a bit later than that. Not too many, but I'm sure that there are some. I have a list of about 250 people that I want to go through in the coming year. I've narrowed it down to about 50 at the moment that I've been pursuing because there are only 24 hours, sadly, in every day. But no, Gwyn, no colonial or early American yet.
And then I think there are two questions I'm going to combine, and I think we'll say this as the last. We had one question is, do you suggest we continue to say women composers in advertising? And then another that's similar to that is, do you think our audience is ready for diversified programming?
I think that for now we should continue to say women composers simply because it still is something that hasn't become normalized, that it still is a rare thing. It shouldn't be, but it still is rather rare. So I think that we need to continue doing that until it does become a more normalized part of our culture. And in turning to whether our audience is ready for diversified programming, I think they are. When I've done, I do a lot of music by women in my own programming, and people really tell me all the time that they like it. I'm sure some people hate it and maybe they just don't come to my concerts. So it isn't a hard and fast proof that audiences are ready. But I think that, yes, I think that audiences are ready. And I think that things are really, our cultural paradigm and our way of thinking is really changing a lot and has changed a lot in the past year from a lot of different places. And so I think that people are ready. And if they're not ready, that maybe perhaps they should be ready.
Well, Dr. Paula Maust, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for this wonderful resource that you've provided for us through expanding the music theory canon and all the web's resources and the continuing work that you're doing. And I should also say the interns that are working with you to make this all possible. Thank you very much. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you everyone who has joined us today and submitted your questions. We're happy that you could be here today. So thank you all, and we will see you at the next Early Music America webinar. Check our website, earlymusicamerica.org, for upcoming events. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you.